In the cold, quiet expanses of medieval Europe, winters were not simply a season, they were a test of survival. Imagine yourself in the midst of this long, bitter cold, living the life of a peasant during the 12th century. You wake each morning in a thatched hut, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and animal dung. The small fire in the hearth offers little warmth, and the cold, damp walls seep through the woolen blankets. Life for peasants was harsh, not just due to their daily toil, but because winter had the potential to wipe out entire communities. The unpredictability of the seasons meant that food could run out quickly, and the cold could drive even the most prepared households into ruin. The peasant's greatest enemy wasn't just starvation, but the cold itself. Winter in the medieval period was a time when the peasant's relationship with the land could either provide them with security or leave them with little hope. The land, of course, was the only asset they truly possessed. For the most part, peasants worked the land of their feudal lords, using the soil to grow enough food to survive the year. But as the cold weather set in, everything changed. Crops failed and fields lay dormant, the once fertile soil now frozen solid. This left peasants relying heavily on what little they had left from the harvest months before. To survive, peasants used every resource they could find. Preserving food became an art form as they pickled vegetables, salted meats, and stored grains in large, airtight barrels. But even with careful preservation, supplies would often dwindle. What could they do when all the stores ran out and the roads were too treacherous to travel? Farming was the most important occupation, but during winter it came to a near halt. Many peasants worked in wool and cloth, spinning thread or weaving textiles. But it wasn't enough to keep them fully occupied, and they often turned to their homes for warmth. The hearth became the center of life, not only as a place for cooking and heating, but as a social gathering point. Family members and animals would huddle together for warmth, a close-knit, often uncomfortable existence. When you think about the suffering of medieval peasants in the winter, what might surprise you is the resilience that helped them survive. Did they simply accept the hardships, or did they have their own secret strategies to stay warm and alive? How did these strategies shape the way we think about winter survival today? As the cold of winter tightened its grip, the survival tactics of medieval peasants grew more resourceful. While the frost killed crops and froze the rivers, these people had to rely on the scant resources available to them. At the heart of their strategies was community. The medieval peasant understood that survival wasn't just about individual effort. It was about sharing, bartering, and pooling resources. But how could they manage such a harsh season with limited supplies? The answer lay in a practice that would seem surprising to us today: the role of food preservation and the ingenious ways they made use of what little they had. Peasants had several methods to endure the deep winter months. They stored dried vegetables, salted meats, and preserved fruits. But they also had to make sure they stayed warm, for warmth was just as important as food. They used simple but effective measures like bedding down in insulated clothing, layering woolen garments, and sealing off any cracks in their huts. Many also relied on communal woodpile stacking, ensuring that every household had enough to burn during the coldest nights. Yet for all their preparation, there was still one very real threat: the risk of illness. The extreme cold brought about sicknesses, and in the cramped, poorly ventilated homes, the spread of diseases could be catastrophic. Illnesses like the common cold, pneumonia, and the more severe outbreaks of plague could devastate entire villages. How did the peasants deal with this constant threat of disease during the winter months? Did they have any treatments, or were they at the mercy of the winter's cruel touch? As much as food preservation and community collaboration helped, there was another, darker aspect of medieval life: the constant specter of hunger. Famine wasn't just a possibility during winter, it was a constant concern. If the previous harvests had been bad, or if the weather didn't cooperate, peasants could starve. The land was unforgiving, and bad harvests could lead to starvation, which often caused not only death but also social unrest. It wasn't uncommon for peasants to resort to eating anything they could find. Root vegetables, animal bones, and even bark from trees became part of their winter diet when food stores were low. But what else did they have to endure? How did these conditions influence their daily life and their view of the coming spring? As the frost of winter finally began to lift, peasants experienced a bittersweet transition. Spring, though a time of renewal, was not the easy relief we might imagine. The thaw of the land brought its own set of challenges. The soil had to be prepared for planting, and this was no small task. After months of being frozen and compacted, it needed to be worked back into a condition where crops could grow again. But before the peasants could begin their new cycle of sowing, there was still the struggle to survive the lingering effects of winter. The cold had worn down both the body and the spirit. The physical exhaustion of surviving on meager rations for months left many feeling weakened, and some would not make it through to spring. For those who did, the next battle was often with the aftermath of famine. Hunger still lingered, and the ground hadn't yet given up its bounty. The village that had been a hub of communal life during the winter now began to burst into activity. The first signs of spring meant it was time to repair what was broken, to gather what was left, and to prepare for the planting season. Peasants worked with newfound energy to tend to their fields, knowing that their survival depended on the success of these crops. This agricultural cycle was more than just a seasonal pattern. It was a lifeline. A single bad harvest could be the difference between life and death, and the peasants knew that all too well. As the season wore on, they could look forward to warmer days and the promise of a new harvest, but these cycles were fraught with risk. Did the peasants, by surviving the winter, truly have any assurance of a good spring or summer? Was survival simply about enduring, or was it about timing and preparation, a never-ending cycle of hope and despair? Reflecting on the resilience of these medieval peasants, we find that their lives were shaped by a constant tension between survival and uncertainty. Their endurance was not just physical, it was psychological. They lived in a world where nature could turn against them at any time, but their persistence, through frost, famine, and fear, allowed them to push through. Perhaps what's most striking about their struggle is how similar it is to our own challenges. While technology and conveniences have drastically changed our world, there's a fundamental human drive to endure and survive that hasn't changed. It's not just about fighting the elements or dealing with scarcity. It's about facing a world that is often out of our control and finding ways to push forward. What then can we learn from these forgotten peasants? Can their resilience in the face of winter's brutality offer us insights into how we confront modern-day challenges, both personal and societal? The quiet lives of Roman tax collectors, unnoticed yet crucial to the empire's survival. In the vast expanse of the Roman Empire, there were countless figures who never earned fame or recognition, yet whose work was fundamental to the empire's stability and growth. One such group was the tax collectors, a class of men whose role, though far from glamorous, was absolutely essential for the smooth functioning of the empire. Imagine yourself living in ancient Rome, a city that ruled over vast territories from Britain to Mesopotamia, with all manner of people, languages, and cultures under its domain. The Roman Empire required an enormous amount of wealth to function, wealth to fund its legions, maintain its infrastructure, and support its imperial ambitions. The task of gathering this wealth fell to tax collectors, men who worked quietly in the background, often hated by the people but crucial to the empire's survival. The Roman tax system was complex, based on a series of direct and indirect taxes that were levied on individuals, land, goods, and even slaves. Tax collectors were the ones who ensured that these payments were made, and their duties ranged from collecting a percentage of agricultural produce to collecting tolls for the use of roads and bridges. The taxes they gathered went into the Roman treasury, which funded everything from military campaigns to the building of aqueducts and roads. However, being a tax collector in the Roman Empire was not an easy job. In many cases, it meant living among those who despised you. While the Roman Senate and wealthy elites generally had an understanding of the necessity of taxes, the common people, the farmers, merchants, and craftsmen, often saw tax collectors as agents of oppression. After all, taxes were not optional, and they were often burdensome, especially for those in the provinces who had little to give. Many tax collectors were given a quota to meet, and if they didn't collect enough, they risked severe penalties. Some were even given the power to seize property and enslave those who could not pay. It was a delicate balance for these men. They had to ensure they collected enough money for the empire, but they had to avoid pushing the population too far, lest a revolt break out. But how did tax collectors reconcile this tension? How did they navigate a world where they were both necessary for the empire's survival and hated by the people they served? What drove these men to take on such a thankless and dangerous role? Were they simply motivated by profit, or was there something else at play? The life of a Roman tax collector was one of contradiction. On one hand, these men were indispensable to the empire, ensuring that the colossal apparatus of Rome, its armies, its infrastructure, and its public projects, was funded. On the other hand, they were often loathed, viewed as parasites by the very people they collected from. So, how did tax collectors manage this precarious existence? In the provinces, where Roman law was less firmly established and the influence of Roman officials was more distant, tax collectors were often private contractors. Known as publicani, they worked on behalf of the state but were generally not government employees. These private contractors would bid for contracts to collect taxes in specific areas. The system allowed them to profit from the taxes they gathered. Anything above their bid amount was theirs to keep. This created a huge incentive for corruption. To meet their quotas, many tax collectors resorted to harsh tactics, including overcharging, bribery, and even extortion. Despite this, there were tax collectors who did not fall into this trap of greed and corruption. Some worked quietly, relying on methods of diplomacy and negotiation to gain compliance from the taxpayers. They would often turn to the elite or local leaders to help mediate the situation, relying on their connections and status to soften the resentment of the general population. In Rome itself, the tax system was more structured, but the resentment still lingered. Citizens in the city were taxed through a system called the centesima rerum venalium, a sales tax that applied to the sale of goods. Roman citizens were also required to pay taxes based on their property and wealth. However, despite the apparent fairness of this system, there was still a pervasive sense that the tax burden was too high. Yet, it wasn't just the method of collection that made tax collectors unpopular. It was their role in enforcing imperial rule. For many peasants in the provinces, tax collectors represented Roman domination. They weren't just men collecting money. They were the agents of an imperial power that had imposed its laws and taxes upon them. These tax collectors were often the face of Roman authority, and in times of unrest, they were often the first to be targeted in uprisings and revolts. But what did the tax collectors themselves think of their work? Did they see themselves as loyal servants of Rome, or did they view their position as a necessary evil, one that allowed them to prosper while being disliked? What were their personal lives like, given the constant tension between their role as enforcers of Roman power and their need to survive in a world that resented their presence? The fact is, very little is known about the personal lives of tax collectors in ancient Rome. They were not typically the subject of grand historical works. We know that they existed, and that they played a crucial role in maintaining the empire's strength, but much of what they experienced remains shrouded in silence. The people who collected taxes were not the generals or politicians who shaped history. They were the ordinary men whose names have faded into the background. The final phase of a Roman tax collector's life often saw them either leaving their posts after a term or accumulating wealth that allowed them to live more comfortably within the Roman elite. But their wealth didn't always translate into peace of mind. Despite their importance, tax collectors lived in constant danger, often from both the people they collected from and from fellow collectors looking to outdo them in their efforts. The system that empowered them to collect taxes was one of immense scale, and for many, the most dangerous aspect was the constant political instability of the empire. Revolts were frequent, and tax collectors were often the first to suffer the consequences. In times of unrest, a particularly oppressive tax collector might be the target of mobs, and even the threat of death wasn't uncommon. Tax collectors would often travel with bodyguards or in groups to protect themselves from these very dangers. The safety of their families was another concern, as they were just as likely to be harmed as their heads of household. However, it wasn't just the risk of violence that loomed large for these men. With their crucial role in the empire's financial structure came a sense of unease and guilt. The empire was constantly expanding, and the demands on its subjects increased accordingly. The tax collectors, in a sense, were the very embodiment of the burden carried by the people. They had to walk a fine line, extracting the money needed to keep Rome's machinery running, while trying to avoid alienating the population to the point of rebellion. Yet, the work of tax collectors did not end with their own personal survival. The taxes they collected allowed the Roman Empire to maintain its grandeur, finance its armies, and maintain law and order. The very infrastructure that allowed the empire to function, from its road systems to its aqueducts, was built through the funds collected by these often overlooked men. It was a far cry from the lavish palaces of Roman emperors or the great feats of military generals. But in a very real way, the survival of Rome depended just as much on the quiet work of tax collectors as on the brilliance of its rulers and soldiers. After leaving their posts, many tax collectors were able to retire with enough wealth to live in relative comfort. They might even invest in land or business, becoming the kind of elite they had once served. Some, however, chose to remain involved in the local political system, using their acquired wealth and influence to continue shaping their communities. Despite their tainted reputation, some were able to turn their experiences into stepping stones for upward mobility, integrating themselves into the fabric of Roman elite society. As the centuries passed, the role of the tax collector in Rome faded into history. Though their work was essential to the empire, their stories remain largely untold. The quiet and often thankless nature of their existence meant that they were relegated to the shadows of history, overshadowed by the more prominent figures who shaped the empire. Yet, as we look back, it's clear that these men, quiet, often despised, but absolutely essential, helped build the empire that has influenced the world to this day. In reflecting on the lives of Roman tax collectors, we might ask ourselves, how do we view those who work in the background today, those who keep society running without the acclaim or recognition they deserve? Is their importance overlooked, just as it was in the Roman Empire? In their quiet work, do they too contribute to the greater system, ensuring its survival? Life in the Dark Ages, the silent resilience of monasteries. The fall of the Roman Empire marked a significant turning point in European history. What followed was a period of turmoil and instability known as the Dark Ages, where much of the once vibrant cultural and intellectual life of Europe seemed to vanish. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, a small group of individuals managed to preserve knowledge, culture, and faith. These individuals were the monks, living in their secluded monasteries scattered across Europe. Picture yourself in the year 500 AD, standing before the entrance of a small Benedictine monastery tucked away in the rolling hills of what is now France. The world outside is one of uncertainty. The great Roman roads are in disrepair, trade routes are largely abandoned, and the empire's former grandeur has faded into the past. The Roman Empire may have crumbled, but these monks, committed to a life of piety and discipline, have continued to maintain a sense of order, faith, and community. Monasteries in the Dark Ages were not just places of religious worship. They were hubs of education, literacy, and preservation. As much of Europe fell into political fragmentation, the monks became the guardians of knowledge. It was within these monasteries that much of the ancient Greek and Roman learning was preserved. The monks painstakingly copied manuscripts, transcribed religious texts, and maintained libraries that held the key to many forgotten civilizations. Without these efforts, much of the knowledge from the ancient world may have been lost forever. But the role of the monks was not solely academic. Monasteries also served as centers for agricultural innovation and social welfare. The monks, bound by a vow of poverty, often had more than enough land to sustain their communities. They developed sophisticated agricultural techniques, using crop rotation, water mills, and other innovations to ensure that their lands remained productive even during times of famine or war. It was their careful stewardship of land that provided the local population with food and stability in a time when such resources were scarce. However, despite their importance, these monasteries were not without their challenges. The period of the Dark Ages was one of constant upheaval. Barbarian invasions, political instability, and economic collapse created a volatile environment in which these isolated communities had to navigate. The monasteries were frequently the targets of raids by Vikings, marauding bands, and other invaders who saw the wealth and resources of the monks as something to be plundered. In such a world, how did the monks survive? What strategies did they employ to ensure their safety and their ability to continue their work? Were they simply isolated from the rest of the world, or did they actively engage with the communities around them to maintain their influence and their survival? Monastic life in the Dark Ages was, at its core, one of discipline and service. The monks followed strict codes of conduct, living under a set of rules, the most famous of which was the rule of Saint Benedict. This rule emphasized humility, obedience, and manual labor, alongside spiritual contemplation and prayer. The monks rose at dawn for their first prayer of the day, and their time was structured around communal worship, study, and labor. Despite the religious and intellectual focus of monastic life, the practical aspects of survival were never far from the monks' minds. To endure in such a hostile and unstable world, monasteries had to be self-sufficient. The monks cultivated their land, grew their food, and often ran small businesses to support themselves. They brewed beer, made cheese, and produced textiles, which they sold or traded with nearby villages and towns. In a way, the monastery became a microcosm of society, a self-sustaining community where work and worship were intertwined. The abbots, or leaders of the monasteries, not only provided spiritual guidance, but also managed the day-to-day operations of the monastery. They oversaw the farming, the production of goods, and the safety of the monks. It was this leadership, along with the collective effort of the monks, that allowed the monasteries to survive. However, survival wasn't always guaranteed. Monasteries were often located in remote, isolated areas, but that didn't mean they were safe from external threats. Viking raids, which began in the 8th century, were particularly devastating. These raids, often unpredictable and brutal, could destroy a monastery in a matter of hours. The Vikings saw the monasteries as both wealthy targets and symbols of Christian authority, and they would often burn down the churches, kill the monks, and steal whatever treasures they could find. Despite these external threats, the monasteries were resilient. Many monks took up arms to defend their homes and their treasures, and the monasteries built walls and fortifications to protect themselves. But perhaps the greatest asset the monasteries had was the support of the local communities. Villages and towns near monasteries often relied on them for food, protection, and spiritual guidance. In return, the monks provided education, medical care, and shelter to those in need. While much of Europe was descending into a state of disarray, these monasteries remained a stabilizing force. They provided a sense of continuity in a world that seemed to be unraveling. The monks didn't just preserve books, they preserved culture, education, and religious practices that would serve as the foundation for the future development of Europe. But even with their resilience, the monasteries faced challenges. How did they balance their role as centers of learning and faith with the harsh realities of survival in a time of constant turmoil? As the centuries passed and Europe slowly emerged from the depths of the Dark Ages, the role of monasteries in preserving and shaping the continent's future became undeniable. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the monasteries had not only survived the chaotic invasions and political instability, but had become symbols of continuity and renewal. During the Carolingian Renaissance in the 8th and 9th centuries, under the reign of Charlemagne, monasteries took on an even greater role in intellectual and cultural revival. Charlemagne, who sought to unify his empire under Christian values, encouraged the building of new monasteries and the preservation of ancient texts. This period saw the rise of scriptoria, rooms dedicated to the copying of manuscripts, and it was here that much of the Roman and Greek knowledge was preserved. The monks, now more than ever, were both the scholars and the scribes who kept alive the intellectual legacy of the ancient world. But their work was not limited to intellectual pursuits alone. In the 11th century, with the rise of the Cistercian order, a new focus on agriculture and self-sufficiency emerged. The Cistercians, in particular, became pioneers in farming techniques, turning the lands surrounding their monasteries into models of productivity. They introduced innovative techniques in the cultivation of crops, improving the quality and quantity of food available. Their understanding of irrigation, crop rotation, and livestock breeding influenced agricultural practices well into the early modern period. Yet, despite their significant contributions to the survival and flourishing of medieval society, the monasteries were not impervious to change. The rise of centralized monarchies, the growth of towns, and the emergence of universities eventually shifted the balance of power in Europe. The authority of the monasteries began to decline, especially with the advent of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Reformers like Martin Luther criticized the wealth and power of the church, and many monasteries were dissolved or reformed. As these institutions faded, the monks' once central role in European society diminished. However, their impact endured. The manuscripts they preserved, the agricultural techniques they pioneered, and the social support systems they created continued to influence European development long after the monasteries themselves lost their political and spiritual dominance. Today, as we reflect on the legacy of these silent yet resilient figures of the Dark Ages, we are left with a fundamental question. In a world where information flows freely and agriculture has advanced beyond the techniques of the past. What can we learn from the perseverance and dedication of these monks? Perhaps it is their ability to adapt to adversity, to preserve knowledge in times of uncertainty, and to build communities that still serves as a lesson. As modern society faces its own challenges, could the spirit of these medieval monks provide us with insights into how we preserve what is most valuable in our world today? How ancient Egyptians stored water, a forgotten feat of engineering. Thousands of years before the modern advancements in irrigation and water management that we take for granted today, the ancient Egyptians were already masters of one of the most critical aspects of survival in a harsh desert environment: water storage. For a civilization that thrived along the banks of the Nile, a river that was both a blessing and a curse, the ability to manage water was central to their agricultural success, and by extension, their survival. Imagine yourself standing on the banks of the Nile River around 3000 BCE, during the height of Egypt's ancient civilization. The mighty Nile, flowing from south to north, brings fertile soil and life-giving water to an otherwise arid land. Yet, as dependable as the Nile's annual flooding was, there were times when it failed to flood properly, or floods arrived too early or too late. In these moments of unpredictability, the Egyptians needed a system to store water, to harness it, and ensure its availability during the dry months when the Nile receded. The ancient Egyptians developed an intricate system of water storage and irrigation that allowed them to thrive in an otherwise inhospitable environment. They built reservoirs, basins, and canals, using natural features of the landscape and enhancing them with their engineering knowledge. One of the most remarkable achievements was their creation of bays and cisterns to hold water, especially in the desert regions where the Nile's floodwaters could not reach. These storage facilities were designed not only to hold large amounts of water, but also to minimize evaporation, which was critical in such a hot and dry environment. But how exactly did the Egyptians store this water? One of their most notable inventions was the shaduf, a simple yet effective hand-operated device used to lift water from the Nile into irrigation channels or storage basins. It worked on a counterweight system, with a bucket attached to a long pole. By balancing the pole with a counterweight, the user could easily dip the bucket into the river, fill it with water, and then lift it to irrigate fields or fill reservoirs. These devices were an integral part of Egypt's water management system, and the ability to transport water with relative ease made it possible for the Egyptians to cultivate land that otherwise would have been barren. But the importance of water storage went beyond agriculture. In a society where water was life, these innovations also provided the Egyptians with a critical resource for drinking, religious rituals, and even the building of monumental structures like the pyramids. Yet, as vital as water storage was, there were still many challenges the Egyptians faced in ensuring a steady supply of water. The flooding of the Nile, while a great gift, was also unpredictable, and a shortage of water could lead to crop failure, famine, and societal unrest. How did the Egyptians balance the risks of flood and drought? What role did their engineering feats play in mitigating these dangers? The ancient Egyptians' ability to manage and store water was critical not only for their agriculture, but also for their ability to create the thriving civilization that lasted for millennia. As much as they depended on the annual flooding of the Nile, they recognized that this was not a guarantee. The river's flow could vary from year to year, sometimes leaving fields parched or creating floods that devastated crops. This uncertainty pushed the Egyptians to develop advanced systems of water management that could compensate for these natural fluctuations. One of the key innovations in Egyptian water storage was the basin irrigation system. This method involved creating a series of embankments around fields to capture and hold water from the Nile's floods. The fields were divided into basins that could be flooded with the river's water, and after the water receded, the soil would be left enriched with silt, making it fertile and ready for planting. This technique was incredibly effective, allowing the Egyptians to control the amount of water their fields received, even in years when the Nile's floods were too weak or too strong. Moreover, Egyptians also dug canals to divert water from the Nile to areas farther away from the river. These canals were used not only for irrigation, but also for transportation. Trade goods, food, and even people were moved via these canals, which facilitated commerce and communication across Egypt's vast empire. The ability to control water meant that the Egyptians could sustain large populations in both the rural and urban areas, ensuring food security and economic stability. However, despite these impressive advancements, the storage and diversion of water were not without their difficulties. The infrastructure required constant maintenance. As the canals and reservoirs were exposed to the elements, they could become clogged with sediment, reducing their efficiency. Dams and reservoirs also had to be rebuilt or repaired regularly to prevent them from breaking. These were large, complex projects that demanded the labor of thousands of workers, including skilled engineers, laborers, and artisans. In addition to their irrigation and storage systems, the Egyptians also focused on techniques to improve the efficiency of water usage. For example, they used water-lifting devices to pump water from canals and reservoirs to fields that were elevated or located far from the river. These included the aforementioned shaduf, but also other devices like norias, water wheels, and screw pumps, early forms of technology that enabled the Egyptians to move water with less physical effort. But even as they mastered the art of water management, the Egyptians could not entirely control the river's whims. There were years when the Nile's floods were too low, and the water simply wasn't enough. In such years, famine and hardship were inevitable. The Egyptian state, therefore, had to rely on reserves of grain and food that had been stored during better years, and the ability to distribute these resources effectively was another critical part of their survival strategy. Yet, even during the best of years, the pressure to ensure a continuous water supply meant that the Egyptians were in a constant state of vigilance. They depended on a network of priests, administrators, and engineers who worked together to keep the system functioning. The viziers, high-ranking officials, would oversee the maintenance of water storage systems and ensure that the necessary resources were available to support the country's people. But did this level of sophistication in water management help the Egyptians avoid famine altogether, or were they simply too dependent on the Nile? Could their innovations in storage and irrigation have ensured their long-term survival? Or was it always a delicate balance between control and uncertainty? As the Egyptian civilization continued to thrive along the banks of the Nile, their sophisticated water management systems became one of the pillars of their success. However, even with all their advancements, the Egyptians remained vulnerable to the unpredictable nature of the river. Their dependence on the Nile for water was both their greatest strength and their most significant weakness. Despite their innovations in water storage and irrigation, the Egyptians faced occasional catastrophic droughts, where the Nile's flood levels were too low to provide adequate water for crops. During these years, agriculture would fail, and the carefully constructed network of canals and basins could not compensate for the lack of water. These low flood years led to famine and hardship. Historical records indicate that these droughts were often followed by social unrest, as hungry peasants rebelled against the ruling class, which they held responsible for their suffering. One of the most devastating periods in Egyptian history occurred during the First Intermediate Period, c. 2181–2055 BCE, a time of political instability, climate changes, and low Nile floods. The period was marked by a collapse of centralized authority and widespread famine. The inability to control water resources was a direct contributor to the breakdown of the Egyptian state. It was only after a period of civil war that the Middle Kingdom emerged, with a renewed focus on strengthening water management systems and restoring the country's agricultural stability. But it wasn't just low floods that posed a threat to Egypt. Occasionally, the Nile would flood too much, devastating crops and infrastructure. In these cases, the Egyptians had to act quickly to repair damage and prevent further loss of life. Their ability to manage both the high and low extremes of the Nile was a testament to their engineering skills, but it also revealed the vulnerability of a society that depended so heavily on one natural source. Despite these challenges, the legacy of Egypt's water management systems endured. Over time, the techniques they pioneered in irrigation and water storage spread to other parts of the ancient world. The knowledge of how to control water and sustain crops was passed down to later civilizations in Greece, Rome, and beyond. The ancient Egyptians didn't just invent irrigation. They revolutionized agriculture in a way that influenced civilizations for centuries to come. As we look back on their remarkable feats of engineering, we are left with a key lesson: the importance of adaptability and foresight. The Egyptians demonstrated that even in the face of unpredictable challenges, societies can thrive if they plan and manage their resources effectively. Their water management systems were not just about survival. They were about creating a lasting legacy of innovation and resilience. In reflecting on the ingenuity of the ancient Egyptians, we might ask ourselves, in our modern world, are we as mindful of our water resources? Do we recognize the delicate balance between abundance and scarcity, and the need for sustainable practices to ensure our future survival? Perhaps the Egyptians' lessons on water management can provide guidance for tackling the global water crises that affect millions today. The pioneers of bread making: how medieval bakers changed the world. In the heart of medieval Europe, beneath the towers of castles and within the walls of bustling towns, the humble baker played an essential yet often overlooked role. Bread, the staple food of the medieval diet, was central to the lives of people from all walks of life, from peasants to kings. It was in the hands of the bakers that the grains of the earth were transformed into one of humanity's oldest and most crucial foods. Imagine yourself in a medieval town, walking along cobbled streets filled with the clatter of carts and the chatter of townsfolk. The smell of freshly baked bread wafts through the air from the bakery, a welcome scent that beckons passers-by. In the bakery itself, the oven glows with the heat necessary to bake the day's loaves. The baker, a craftsman in his own right, works with dough made from wheat, barley, or rye, kneading it with a practiced hand. Though his work may seem simple, it is essential to the survival of the community. Bread making in medieval times was far from easy. Bakers worked long hours, often beginning before dawn to ensure that their bread was ready to sell to the townspeople by the time the sun rose. The process was an intricate one, requiring careful attention to the quality of the flour, the fermentation of the dough, and the evenness of the heat in the oven. Bread was baked in large loaves that could feed families for days, and in many cases, it was the primary source of sustenance for the medieval population. Yet the craft of bread making was more than just a daily task. It was a vital piece of the social and economic fabric of the medieval world. The size and quality of the bread a person could afford often reflected their social status. The rich ate fine, white bread made from the best wheat, while the poor ate coarse bread made from rye or barley, often mixed with other grains. Bread, in many ways, was the great equalizer. Everyone ate it, but how much and of what quality depended on one's wealth and position in society. However, medieval bakers didn't just make bread. They played a significant role in maintaining the health of their community. The quality of bread was tightly regulated, and in many places, laws were enacted to ensure that bread was sold fairly and safely. In England, for example, the assize of bread and ale, introduced in the 12th century, set regulations on the price and weight of bread, ensuring that bakers didn't overcharge or underproduce. The role of the baker was thus not only economic, but also political, as they were often subject to the scrutiny of local authorities. But why did bread become so important to medieval society? Why was it considered such a staple? And how did bakers manage to create such an essential product in a time without the modern conveniences we take for granted? What other innovations did they bring to their craft that helped improve the quality of life for people in the Middle Ages? As medieval society continued to evolve, so did the craft of bread making. Bakers were not just makers of food. They were innovators who pioneered methods and techniques that would eventually shape the way bread was made for centuries to come. In a world without refrigeration, artificial preservatives, or even modern milling techniques, the bakers of medieval Europe had to find clever ways to keep their bread fresh and ensure its availability to the population throughout the year. One of the most important developments in bread making during this time was the use of leavening agents. The process of fermentation, in which natural yeast from the air or from previous batches of dough would cause the dough to rise, was already known in ancient times. but medieval bakers refined it. They began to use sourdough starters, a mixture of flour and water that naturally fermented over time, creating a base for leavening bread. This starter would be passed down from one baker to the next, a living organism that could be used to ferment dough for generations. In addition to fermentation, medieval bakers also had to contend with the challenges of consistency and the limitations of their equipment. Unlike modern ovens with precise temperature control, medieval ovens were wood-fired and required constant attention to maintain an even heat. Bakers often worked in large communal ovens, which were shared by multiple families or businesses. This communal system ensured that bread could be baked on a larger scale, but it also created potential for disputes over the quality of bread and the oven's maintenance. Yet despite these challenges, the medieval baker had an important role in shaping both the food culture and the social life of the town. Bread was often the centerpiece of daily meals, eaten at every table, regardless of wealth. In wealthier homes, bread was accompanied by meats, cheeses, and fruits, while in poorer households it might be eaten with soups or stews, or used to soak up the broth. For peasants, the daily loaf of bread was sometimes the only meal they could rely on. Interestingly, bread making also had a deep connection to religious practices. In medieval Europe, the bread used in Christian ceremonies was considered sacred. The act of baking bread for the Eucharist, the body of Christ, elevated the baker's craft to something divine. Bakers were often required to make the finest bread for church services, and the church itself frequently played a role in overseeing the quality of bread sold to the community. But even as bread was essential to the medieval economy and culture, there were times when it was not enough. During periods of famine, when crops failed or the population grew too large for the land to sustain, bread became a symbol of hunger and scarcity. The bread riots of the late medieval period, particularly in cities like Paris and London, were direct responses to rising bread prices and food shortages. When bread became too expensive for the common people, they often took to the streets in protest, leading to social unrest and even political upheaval. Despite these periods of scarcity, the craft of bread making continued to thrive, and it was in the medieval period that many of the foundational techniques of modern baking were established. The use of fermentation, the development of specialized ovens, and the rise of bread as a cultural and economic cornerstone laid the groundwork for what would later become an industrialized baking system in the modern era. So, as we look back on the role of medieval bakers, we must ask, how did they manage to maintain such a vital and complex system with the limited technology available to them? How did their innovations in baking and water management, essential for making bread, create a lasting legacy that would continue to shape the way we eat today? As we reflect on the role of medieval bakers, it becomes clear that their craft went beyond the mere creation of bread. Bread was not just sustenance, it was a symbol of life itself, of the cycles of nature, and of the community's resilience in the face of hardship. In medieval Europe, bread was often considered a gift from God, a daily miracle that sustained the body as much as the soul. The work of bakers, therefore, was seen as a vital contribution to the well-being of society, one that was deeply embedded in both religious and social life. By the 14th and 15th centuries, bread making had become a profession regulated by guilds. These guilds were organizations that set the standards for production, ensured quality control, and protected the interests of their members. Bakers who were part of a guild were granted certain privileges and protections, but they were also bound by strict codes of conduct. They had to adhere to regulations about the price of bread, the weight of loaves, and the methods of production. The guilds ensured that bread was produced consistently, even during times of scarcity. However, while the guilds helped maintain quality, they also set limits on competition. Only those who were accepted as guild members could legally bake and sell bread. This system, though protective for the baker, could also lead to monopolies and disputes. Bakers had to ensure their bread met the quality standards of the guild, or risk being fined, or even having their business shut down. As bread became increasingly central to urban life, bakeries themselves became more specialized. In larger towns and cities, bakeries began to develop different types of bread for different needs. There were rich, white breads for the elite and coarse, dark rye breads for the poor. There were sweet breads flavored with spices or fruit for festivals and special occasions. In cities like Paris, Florence, and London, bakers were seen as masters of their craft, their expertise passed down through generations. Many bakeries even had their own branding, with unique stamps or marks on the bread to identify their origin. At the same time, bakers found themselves at the mercy of the political and economic conditions of the time. During times of war or political instability, bread became even more precious. Armies on the move relied on bread as a portable, long-lasting source of nutrition. But in periods of peace and prosperity, bread became more than just food. It became part of the social fabric. In the medieval feast, bread was central. It was used to scoop up soups and sauces, to complement meats, and to serve as the foundation for elaborate dishes. Yet, for all the focus on bread's central role in medieval life, we must not forget the darker side of its importance. In times of famine, when bread was scarce, its absence could bring about revolutions. As mentioned earlier, bread riots were common in medieval Europe, especially when prices were raised or when a bad harvest led to shortages. These uprisings often led to swift government action, as the ruling classes understood that a hungry population was a volatile one. The medieval baker, therefore, occupied a unique position in society. He was both revered for his craft and simultaneously vulnerable to the demands of the people he served. Bread was essential for survival, and yet it was also a tool of social control. The baker was caught between these two realities, a purveyor of life-sustaining sustenance and a figure who had to balance the delicate economics of food production and distribution. As we look at the legacy of medieval bread making, we must ask ourselves, what does the story of the medieval baker tell us about the importance of food in shaping society? How do the changes in the way we produce and consume bread today reflect broader social, political, and economic shifts? And in a world of industrialized baking, what can we learn from the methods and craftsmanship of those early bakers who created the foundation of the bread we eat today? From silk to paper, the ordinary craftsmen behind ancient China's greatest inventions. In ancient China, the intersection of culture, technology, and craftsmanship gave rise to some of the most extraordinary inventions in human history. While the names of emperors and generals often dominate historical narratives, the real unsung heroes of ancient China were the ordinary craftsmen, the artisans whose skills and innovations shaped the course of civilization. From the weaving of silk to the invention of paper, these craftsmen worked in the shadows of grand courts, quietly transforming the world through their knowledge and ingenuity. Imagine yourself in the heart of ancient China during the Han Dynasty, around 100 BCE. The bustling markets are filled with merchants, soldiers, and scholars. Amidst the sounds of daily life, a quiet group of artisans sits at their looms, spinning fine threads of silk. Their hands move with precision, weaving intricate patterns that will eventually become the treasured silk garments for the royal court and affluent families. This was no ordinary fabric. It was a symbol of wealth, luxury, and power, and it was created by the skill of these often overlooked workers. Silk was, in many ways, the foundation of China's greatness. The silk industry wasn't just about producing beautiful garments. It was central to the economy and culture of China. The craft of silk weaving began over 4,000 years ago, and by the time of the Han Dynasty, it had become so refined that Chinese silk was sought after all across the ancient world. The Silk Road, a network of trade routes stretching from China to the Mediterranean, carried these prized fabrics to distant lands, exchanging not just goods, but ideas and culture between East and West. But the creation of silk wasn't just a matter of weaving. The entire process, from raising the silkworms to spinning the thread, was a highly labor-intensive process that required specialized knowledge. These craftsmen, working in near anonymity, perfected techniques that involved raising silkworms on mulberry leaves, harvesting their cocoons, and then spinning the delicate threads into a fine, lustrous material. The silkworm's life cycle was understood in great detail by these artisans, who had passed down their knowledge through generations. As important as silk was to ancient China's identity, another equally significant invention emerged from the same age: paper. It is often credited to the Chinese inventor Kai Lun in 105 CE, but like silk weaving, the invention of paper was not a sudden revelation. It was the culmination of centuries of experimentation by craftsmen who worked with natural fibers, wood, and plant materials. The creation of paper was, in many ways, a revolutionary step forward. Before its invention, written materials were inscribed on bamboo strips, silk, or wooden tablets, materials that were cumbersome, expensive, and not easily accessible. Paper, made from wood pulp and other fibers, was lightweight, relatively inexpensive, and durable. It allowed for the mass production of books, which in turn facilitated the spread of knowledge and culture. But how did the creation of paper come about? It was the work of ordinary people, those who worked with plant fibers, bark, and other natural materials. They experimented with pulping fibers, pressing them into thin sheets, and drying them in the sun. What began as an artisanal process grew into an industry, as paper became an indispensable part of Chinese life and culture. From the first paper documents to the creation of the printing press centuries later, the effects of paper on the world were profound. In the context of these inventions, we must consider: how did these craftsmen manage to create such transformative technologies with the tools and resources available to them? How did they manage to revolutionize materials that, though simple by today's standards, became the foundation for global commerce, communication, and culture? The evolution of paper-making in ancient China was far from a linear process. It was an intricate development, built upon centuries of trial, error, and refinement by those who worked with materials found in their natural surroundings. The key to the creation of paper lay in the ability to break down plant fibers into a pulp, something that required not just skill, but a deep understanding of nature and its processes. The transformation of organic materials into a writing surface that could rival the durability of silk was a feat that most likely took many hands and many years to perfect. Before paper, the Chinese used bamboo strips for writing. These strips were heavy, cumbersome, and not easily portable. They were also difficult to handle in large quantities. The process of inscribing on bamboo required skilled laborers, but even so, it was inefficient for large-scale communication. The use of silk, though lightweight and portable, was costly and impractical for everyday use. As trade flourished along the Silk Road, a more practical medium for writing was clearly needed. This is where the ordinary craftsman came in. Over the centuries, they experimented with plant fibers like hemp, bamboo, and rags, each of which was woven or pulped to create different textures and durability. Eventually, they stumbled upon the key ingredients for paper making: wood fibers and plant-based pulp, creating a material that was both strong and versatile. This technique, likely developed in workshops or small communities, became one of the most transformative inventions in human history. The credit for the invention of paper is often given to Kai Lun, a eunuch and official at the imperial court during the Eastern Han Dynasty, in 105 CE. Kai Lun's contribution, however, was not so much the creation of paper, but the formalization and refinement of the paper-making process. He made paper production more accessible by simplifying the materials, including bamboo fibers, wood, and rags, making it possible to produce paper at scale. His improvements, which included using a pulp made from these materials, allowed for the efficient creation of writing surfaces that were both cheaper and more abundant than silk or bamboo. Once Kai Lun's papermaking method was established, the impact on Chinese society was immediate and profound. Not only did it transform the way records were kept, but it also revolutionized communication. The invention of paper created new opportunities for education, literature, and administration, allowing for the mass production of books and documents. By the 8th century, the Chinese were using paper extensively for everything from official decrees and legal documents to poetry and philosophy. The spread of paper-making techniques along the Silk Road carried the technology to Korea, Japan, and the Islamic world, ultimately reaching Europe by the 12th century. At the same time, the rise of block printing in China further cemented paper's importance. The invention of woodblock printing, which allowed for entire pages to be carved into wooden blocks and then inked and pressed onto paper, took papermaking to another level. This development meant that books could be produced faster and cheaper than ever before. The famous Diamond Sutra, printed in China in 868 CE, is one of the earliest examples of a printed book, and it is written on paper, signifying the incredible reach and utility of this invention. As papermaking spread, it not only changed the nature of communication, but also contributed to the growth of knowledge across cultures. It provided the foundation for literature, science, and philosophy, and laid the groundwork for the Renaissance in Europe. But in reflecting on these advancements, we must ask ourselves, how did such a seemingly simple craft, transforming pulp into paper, end up shaping the course of human civilization? How did the collective efforts of these craftsmen, working with their hands in relative obscurity, have such an impact on the world? As the centuries passed, the profound impact of paper on global civilization became increasingly evident. What began as a simple craft in the workshops of ancient China eventually transformed the way human knowledge was shared, recorded, and preserved. The invention of paper didn't just affect China, it affected the entire world. By the 8th century, papermaking had spread across the Silk Road, traveling westward through the Islamic world and eventually reaching Europe by the 12th century. The Arabs were among the first to adopt and refine papermaking techniques, and they played a key role in spreading the art to the Mediterranean. By the time paper reached Europe, it had already undergone significant improvements, such as the introduction of watermarks and the refinement of the papermaking process. In Europe, the invention of paper sparked a revolution in communication and the spread of knowledge. The most significant of these developments was the printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century. Gutenberg's printing press made use of paper and movable type to mass-produce books, allowing information to be disseminated on an unprecedented scale. This development, which was built upon centuries of papermaking, helped usher in the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment, sparking a transformation in art, science, and philosophy. The impact of paper wasn't just confined to literature or intellectual pursuits. It also revolutionized commerce and administration. With the ability to create durable, inexpensive documents, governments and businesses could now maintain extensive records. Paper became the backbone of the modern bureaucratic system, enabling the complex management of resources, trade, and taxes that was required for the growth of empires and nation-states. It was on paper that treaties were signed, laws were written, and financial transactions were recorded. Paper was the medium through which human civilization managed its complexity. Despite the monumental changes paper brought to the world, it is easy to overlook the work of those early craftsmen, the weavers of silk, the pulp makers, and the artisans who laid the foundation for these great advances. The paper makers of ancient China, working with limited tools and knowledge, set the stage for an entire new era of human progress. Their quiet contributions, though often ignored in the broader sweep of history, enabled the dissemination of ideas and knowledge that would change the world forever. In looking back at these ordinary craftsmen, we are reminded of the power of small, seemingly mundane innovations. The invention of paper, like many other great leaps in history, began as a craft, a skill passed from one generation to the next in relative obscurity. Yet, the ripple effects of their work would reverberate across centuries, shaping the very foundation of modern civilization. So, as we move forward in our increasingly digital world, it's worth asking, what are the ordinary crafts of today that may be shaping the future in ways we cannot yet foresee? What innovations, created by hands working quietly in the background, will one day be recognized as the catalysts of the next great wave of human progress? The unsung heroes of the Black Plague, how lowly physicians saved lives. The Black Plague, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, remains one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, killing an estimated 25–30 million people, nearly a third of Europe's population. The plague spread quickly, devastating entire towns and cities, leaving a trail of death and despair. Amidst the chaos, most of Europe turned to their physicians, doctors who, though often working with rudimentary and incorrect understanding of disease, nevertheless played a crucial role in mitigating the effects of the plague. These physicians, many of whom were poor and without formal medical training, are now often overshadowed by the more famous figures in history. But their work in preventing further spread of the disease and attempting to save lives was far more significant than we often give them credit for. Picture yourself in a medieval town during the peak of the Black Plague. The air is thick with fear, and the streets are empty, save for the occasional cart carrying the dead. The disease, which was spread by fleas carried by rats, had already begun to take its toll. You may be a physician, or perhaps simply a layperson caught in the storm, but you are faced with an enemy that cannot be seen, an enemy that moves faster than you can comprehend. The physicians, although they had little understanding of germs or the true nature of infection, were among the few who had some form of medical training. They were charged with caring for the sick, and although their treatments were often misguided or ineffective, their role in these dire times cannot be underestimated. Physicians in the medieval period were not the highly trained professionals we think of today. Medical knowledge was based on ancient texts by Greek and Roman scholars, which were often misinterpreted or incomplete. They understood the body's humors and the concept of imbalance, but they lacked the knowledge of bacteria, viruses, and the actual mechanisms behind infection. Doctors often used herbal remedies, bloodletting, and crude surgical procedures to treat their patients. In the case of the Black Plague, some physicians wore plague masks, which were long-beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, believing that the bad air or miasma could be kept at bay. These physicians, though misguided in their understanding of disease transmission, were doing the best they could with the limited knowledge they had. However, despite their lack of scientific understanding, physicians made a significant contribution during the plague in other ways. As many died and the death toll climbed, the medical community took on the responsibility of organizing quarantine measures, closing off infected homes, and advising local authorities on how to limit the spread. They also played a role in trying to calm the panic and offer what little comfort they could to the grieving families. Many physicians also participated in the establishment of plague hospitals, which were set up to house the infected and prevent them from spreading the disease further. Though rudimentary, these hospitals helped separate the sick from the healthy and minimize the chances of further outbreaks. But how did these physicians, with their limited understanding, manage to have such a vital impact on the population? What allowed them to act with such courage and determination, even when faced with a disease they didn't fully understand? And how did they, despite their lack of tools or effective treatments, manage to leave such a significant mark on history? As the Black Plague ravaged Europe, it was not just the physicians who played an important role, but the broader medical community, which often included laypeople, herbalists, and even clergy members who assisted with the sick. The response to the plague was shaped not only by the official doctors, but by a network of individuals who, though not formally trained in medicine, possessed practical knowledge of herbal remedies and folk healing traditions. These healers were often the first responders in the villages and towns where doctors were scarce. One of the most significant roles that physicians and healers played during the Black Plague was in attempting to control the spread of the disease through quarantine measures. The idea of quarantining the sick was not fully understood at the time, but physicians and public health officials attempted to isolate infected individuals and their families to prevent further outbreaks. Infected houses were often marked with painted signs or banners, signaling to others that the plague was within. In some cases, entire neighborhoods or towns were locked down, and the movement of people was restricted. The Italian city of Venice was one of the first to implement a formal quarantine system in 1377, which was a critical step in slowing the spread of the plague. Ships arriving from plague-infected areas were forced to anchor offshore for 40 days. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. While the practice was based on limited understanding, it was a practical response that showed the growing recognition of the need to isolate the sick to prevent widespread transmission. Physicians also played an essential role in attempting to record and observe the plague's impact. Although they did not have the tools of modern epidemiology, many doctors kept careful records of the symptoms, the rate of death, and the patterns of the disease. These observations, though rudimentary, were some of the first steps toward understanding how diseases spread. By noting that the plague seemed to move from person to person in close quarters, some early physicians helped lay the groundwork for the later discovery of infectious diseases. However, despite the best efforts of physicians and medical practitioners, the treatments available were largely ineffective. Bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and even the use of lucky charms or amulets were prescribed in an attempt to ward off the disease. Some believed that the plague was a punishment from God, and the clergy, alongside physicians, would offer prayers and religious rites to appease divine wrath. In times of such overwhelming tragedy, these spiritual and ritualistic actions provided a sense of comfort to the afflicted, even if they had little scientific grounding. Yet, amid this chaos, there were a few physicians who attempted to move beyond the medical paradigms of the time and make more scientific observations. One such physician was Giovanni Boccaccio, a renowned Italian author who documented the course of the plague in his famous work, The Decameron. Though Boccaccio was more a writer than a physician, his observations about the behavior of the disease were astute for the time. He noted how it spread quickly, without distinction of class or age, and how the poor were particularly vulnerable due to their living conditions. While his work was not a medical manual, it reflected a growing awareness of the importance of the environment and the nature of the disease. While much of what medieval physicians understood about the Black Plague was inaccurate, their efforts were not entirely in vain. They helped foster early methods of isolation, observed the symptoms of the disease, and contributed to the development of more organized public health systems. Their responses, though based on incorrect assumptions, ultimately paved the way for more rigorous scientific investigations in the centuries that followed. But what can we learn from these early physicians and healers who faced an overwhelming crisis with so little knowledge? How did their resilience in the face of a seemingly unstoppable pandemic help to shape the future of medicine? And what role did their failures play in pushing humanity toward more effective medical responses? As the Black Plague continued to claim lives across Europe, the resilience and efforts of physicians, despite their limited understanding, became an enduring part of the larger story of human survival during pandemics. While many of the treatments they employed were ineffective or even harmful, their role in organizing quarantine measures, documenting the symptoms, and contributing to the early forms of public health measures was foundational for the future of medicine. The aftermath of the plague marked a significant turning point in the development of public health and medical practices. Following the devastation of the Black Plague, there was a significant push to improve the understanding of diseases and how they spread. The failure of traditional medical methods during the plague led to the questioning of long-held beliefs about disease. While medieval medicine was rooted in the teachings of ancient philosophers like Galen and Hippocrates, the crisis of the plague encouraged more empirical approaches to understanding illness, eventually giving rise to modern epidemiology. Over time, the idea of contagion and germ theory began to take root. Physicians, scientists, and thinkers such as Giovanni Filippo Ingrassia, an Italian physician in the 16th century, began to push for a better understanding of disease transmission. While it would take centuries for germ theory to be fully developed, the Black Plague played a crucial role in sparking the scientific curiosity that eventually led to groundbreaking discoveries in microbiology. The Black Plague also had a significant impact on the medical profession. After the plague, the role of the physician became more structured and professionalized. Physicians began to receive more formal education, and there was an increasing emphasis on medical schools and universities where students could learn scientific methods and theories. The early failings of medieval medicine during the plague contributed to the eventual rise of scientific medicine, where observation, experimentation, and data collection became integral components of medical practice. Interestingly, the pandemic had broader societal effects too. The physicians who worked during the plague were not only battling the disease, they were also attempting to fight the pervasive fear and panic that came with it. The mass death and uncertainty fostered a culture of fear, and physicians were often tasked with not only caring for the sick, but also managing the emotional and psychological toll on the public. Their role, therefore, expanded beyond their traditional medical duties. In many ways, these physicians helped set the stage for the role that healthcare workers would play in future global crises, where medical and emotional support would become equally important. As we reflect on the impact of these lowly physicians, it's important to remember that their work, though limited by the medical knowledge of the time, was invaluable. Without their attempts to understand the plague, to treat the sick, and to put systems in place to manage its spread, Europe would have faced even greater devastation. Their efforts laid the groundwork for the development of public health systems, the advancement of medical science, and the creation of a more structured approach to combating infectious diseases. In the end, while the Black Plague remains one of the most devastating events in human history, it was also a turning point. The legacy of those early physicians, whose courage in the face of the unknown helped save lives and shape the future of medicine, is one that should not be overlooked. Their willingness to confront the crisis, even without the tools we now take for granted, demonstrates the power of resilience in the face of unimaginable odds. So, as we consider the lessons of the past, one question remains. What are the lessons we can take from these early responses to pandemics? How can we apply their resilience, their resourcefulness, and their willingness to adapt in our own efforts to face global health challenges today?